The people who laughed at Maren Solberg's cooking on the first night of the trip were the same ones who came crawling to her fire on the third. If you've ever been written off by people who later needed what only you could give, subscribe to the channel and ring the bell, and tell us your story in the comments below. There is a kind of laughter that is not really about what it's pointed at. It is about the person doing the laughing, what they need to believe, what they need to be true about themselves, and what or who they need to be smaller than in order to feel that way. Maren Solberg had heard that kind of laughter before. She'd heard it at her husband's funeral when her brother-in-law made a quiet joke about whether she'd manage the property alone, and she'd watched the people around him decide whether to smile. She'd heard it at the bank when she asked about refinancing, and the loan officer had tilted his head with that particular smile people use when the answer is already decided and they're just performing the courtesy of the question. And she heard it again on the first night of the Elkhorn Basin group camping trip in the mountains of Montana when she pulled out her cast-iron skillet. The skillet was old. It had belonged to her husband Dale, and before Dale to his father, and before his father to someone whose name nobody remembered anymore, but whose care was still written in the surface of the iron, smooth as riverstone in the center, dark as a winter creek, seasoned by decades of fires built in places where the wind came down off the high country and the temperature dropped fast after sundown. Maren had learned to cook on it in the first years of her marriage. She had cooked on it for 31 years. She knew its heat the way you know a person's voice, which direction it ran hot, how long it needed before it was ready, where to set the pan to keep things from scorching. She knew it the way she knew very few things, without thinking, from the inside. But that first evening, while the rest of the group assembled their propane stoves and their foil camp packets and their color-coded dehydrated meals in their color-coded stuffed sacks, Maren Solberg knelt in the dirt and built a fire. Todd Greer, 43, loud, the kind of man who talked about gear the way other people talked about their children, noticed first. "You serious with that thing?" he said, nodding at the skillet. "Every time," said Maren. He laughed. Two others laughed. A woman named Brenda, who had spoken at length that afternoon about her titanium cookware, laughed, and then looked away in that way people do when they want to laugh more, but feel they've already shown enough. Maren said nothing. She set the skillet on the grate over her fire and started cutting onions on the flat rock she'd been using as a camp cutting board for 40 years. She had not wanted to come on this trip. Her daughter Claire had signed her up without asking, one of those well-meaning ambushes that adult children sometimes launch at their recently widowed mothers. "You need to get out, Mom. You need to be around people," said with the certainty that 30-somethings have about what their parents need. Maren had nodded the way she nodded at most things now, with her mouth only, while the rest of her waited for the conversation to be over. Dale had died 14 months ago. Congestive heart failure, which was what they called it when a big man with a big laugh and a big life got squeezed down to nothing over the course of 3 winters. She'd had 14 months to learn how to sleep alone, to eat alone, to sit on the porch in the evening without saying anything to anyone because there was no longer anyone to say things to. She was getting better at it. Not good at it. Better, the group was 12 people, couples mostly, a few pairs of friends, and Maren, who was one. The camp coordinator was a man named Gary Hatch who wore an orange vest and spoke with the authority of someone who had once done a wilderness course and never stopped thinking about it. Gary had a system for everything: where to pitch tents, which trail to take to the water source, how to hang food, when to sleep. He had distributed a laminated card with the camp schedule on the drive-in. He had frowned, briefly but visibly, When Marin arrived with her canvas pack and her iron skillet and her hand-split kindling bundled and brought from home. "We have a group fire," Gary had said. "I know," said Marin. "I'll have my own." Gary had looked at her with the expression of a man whose laminated card had not accounted for this. The first evening, Marin made skillet cornbread from a recipe she'd memorized so long ago that she no longer remembered learning it. She made it with bacon drippings stored in a small tin, fresh rosemary clipped from her garden that morning, and she cooked it with a flat stone resting on top of the skillet to hold the heat down into the bread. It came out golden at the edges and dark where it touched the iron, with a bottom crust that rang when you tapped it. She ate it alone. 3 camps over, she could hear the hiss of propane and the crinkle of foil. She could hear Todd Greer explaining optimal temperature settings to someone who had stopped listening. She opened her husband Dale's old field notebook, its cover held together now with a strip of electrician's tape. 30 years of trips filling it from front to back in Dale's careful handwriting, and she wrote down what she'd made and how the fire had run and what she'd change next time. Dale had always kept notes. She'd thought it was excessive when he was alive. She'd been doing it herself since October. She wasn't sure yet whether it helped. It gave the evenings somewhere to go. That was the night she heard the laughter, not at the cornbread, at something someone said at the group fire, but it came across the dark at her the way laughter does when you're sitting alone, as a reminder of distance, as a measurement of how far you are from the center of things. She closed the notebook and looked at the fire. The skillet sat beside it, cooling, patient, exactly as it always was. What none of them knew was that she had been cooking over open fires in these mountains since before any of them had bought their first piece of gear. The second day was blue skies and granite and the kind of cold that seems friendly until you stop moving. The group hiked out to Elkhorn Lake and back, 9 miles of switchbacks and scree, and Marin walked at her own pace near the back without talking much. She noticed things as she walked. The way the aspens at the lower elevation had already lost half their leaves when they should have had 2 more weeks. The way a pair of ravens were working a ridgeline to the west with that particular urgency that ravens have when the weather is about to shift. The way the air smelled of iron and cold stone and something coming. Dale had taught her to read weather 30 years ago, and she'd been doing it so long it had become something she did the way she breathed, without deciding to. What she saw on the western ridge that afternoon made her walk a little faster on the way back. She said nothing to Gary Hatch. She considered it, then remembered the laminated card and the expression he'd given her skillet, and she went back to her campsite and started organizing. She moved her firewood supply under the tarp overhang. She checked her tent seams. She found the spots where water would run if it ran hard and redirected them with a shallow trench and 2 flat stones. She laid extra kindling against the inside of the wood ring to keep it dry. She filled both water vessels and covered them. When she was done, she stood in the center of her camp and looked at it with the practiced eye of someone checking a thing they'll need to trust later. In the dark, under pressure. Brenda wandered by and watched for a moment. "Getting ready for something?" "Just getting organized," said Marin. Brenda nodded and drifted back toward the group fire. That night, Marin made a 1-pot stew in the skillet. Venison she'd processed herself in November, dried mushrooms from the woods behind her property, dried herbs in a small cloth pouch she replenished every fall the way her mother had, and her mother's mother before that. She knew from 30 years of open-fire cooking how to build a stew that didn't need watching, that could sit and deepen on its own while she tended the fire around it, adding wood. Managing the heat by moving the skillet slightly left or right on the grate in a language too subtle to explain, but too practiced to be anything but second nature. The smell moved through camp the way smells do in camp, which is everywhere at once. Paul, a quiet man from Billings, who had barely spoken all day, drifted by with his coffee cup. He stood at the edge of her fire and said simply, "That smells incredible." Maren handed him a piece of the cornbread she'd kept from the night before. He ate it in one bite and stood there a moment without saying anything. "Come eat if you want," she said. "I made enough." Paul and his wife Janet ate with her that night. Afterward, Janet said she hadn't eaten that well on a camping trip since she was 12. Maren wrote it all down in the notebook when they left. What she'd used, how the fire had run, how long the mushrooms had soaked, what the stew needed and what it didn't. The wind had shifted in the last 2 hours, coming from the northwest now, heavy with something it was holding back. She added that to the notebook too. Then she banked her fire with care, set the skillet aside on a dry stone, and went to bed. That night she slept with her boots inside her sleeping bag. The snow started at 3 in the morning. Maren woke to the weight of it on her tent, not a dramatic sound, just a gradual muffling. The way heavy snow takes everything that was sharp and makes it soft, and then quiet. And then gone. She checked her watch. She lay still and listened. Then she got up, put on her layers in the dark with the practiced speed of someone who has done this many times, and went out. The camp was white and still. The group fire, banked according to Gary Hatch's laminated card, was out, smothered under 6 inches of wet, heavy snow that was still coming. The wind from the northwest had dropped the temperature 20 degrees in 4 hours. 2 tents on the north side of the group site were leaning badly under the weight. Maren went back into her tent and dressed fully. Then she went to her wood supply under the tarp overhang. It was dry. She built her fire the way she always built it. Tinder first. The dry grass she kept in a sealed tin, then pencil-thin kindling, then finger-thick, then wrist-thick, feeding it slowly and reading it at each stage, adjusting the arrangement of the wood. Patient in the way that you can only be patient when you have done something so many times that the outcome no longer frightens you. She didn't rush. Rushing a fire when the conditions are wet and cold is how you lose the fire. By 4:30, she had a real fire. Not just flames, but coals, sustained and deep. The kind that produces heat without requiring constant feeding, the kind that holds through weather. She put the skillet on. She started coffee from the grounds she kept in a small sealed jar. The smell of wood smoke and coffee went through the white, silent camp like a voice. By 5, Todd Greer was standing at the edge of her firelight. He was in his full-down kit and his expensive boots, and he had the look of a man who has just spent 2 hours in a cold tent failing to start a propane burner in the wind. "Our wood is soaked," he said. No laughter in his voice now, nothing in his voice but the plain fact. "I know," said Maren. "Pull up something to sit on." By 5:30, 6 of the 12 were at her fire. By 6, all 12 were there. Gary Hatch had brought his laminated card. He was looking at it the way you look at instructions that no longer match the situation you're in. The coffee went around. Nobody said much. The fire was what held them, not just the heat of it, but the fact of it, the solidity of it in all that white, cold silence. Maren put the skillet back on and began to cook. She cracked eggs into the skillet, added the last of the dried mushrooms, added the rosemary, kept the heat even the way she knew how to keep it. She did not perform any of this. She did not explain. She just cooked, the way she always cooked, and the smell went up into the cold gray morning air like something remembered. And then she looked up and saw something that made her set down the skillet. It was the field notebook. Paul had picked it up from beside the woodpile, not knowing what it was, and he was turning it open to the first page, reading Dale's handwriting, the neat, careful columns where Dale had logged every trip, every condition, every observation about how the mountains behaved. Is this a camp journal?" "My husband's," said Marin. "And mine now." Paul turned to a page near the middle. He read in silence for a moment, then looked up slowly. "There's a note here about this exact area, Elkhorn Basin. It says—" He stopped, read it again. "It says the Northwest Ridge always pulls a hard storm in from Canada when the pressure drops before October. It says if the marmots go quiet at noon, move your wood under cover." Marin looked at the fire. "He'd been coming here for 30 years, she said quietly. "He knew things about this place that aren't on any map." Nobody said anything for a moment. "Did the marmots go quiet yesterday?" Janet asked. She asked it very softly, the way people ask things when they already half know the answer. "Around noon," said Marin. "Yes." Paul set the notebook down carefully, the way you set something down when you've just understood what it is. Gary Hatch looked at his laminated card. Then he set it beside the notebook. Both of them sat there on the wood ring in the firelight, and nobody picked either of them up for a long time. It was Brenda who finally said it. An hour later, when the coffee was going around a second time, and the skillet was full of eggs and rosemary, and the smell of it was layered into everyone's clothes and hair, and would stay there for days. "I want to ask you something," Brenda said. She looked at Marin directly, not at the fire. "And I want to apologize first. For the way we were the first night with the skillet. And the laughing." Marin looked at her across the fire. "You don't have to apologize. I know I don't have to. I want to." There was a pause in which the fire said the only thing that needed saying. "Where did you learn all of this?" Brenda asked. "The fire, the food, reading the weather, knowing last night before any of us knew. Where does that come from?" Marin thought about it, not because the answer wasn't ready, but because she wasn't sure it would make sense, said plainly. She looked at the field notebook sitting on the log beside her. She looked at the skillet. "My husband taught me the first part," she said finally. 30 years of that. Being out here with him. Watching him. Listening to him. He knew things the way old people know things, quietly, from experience, and not because it was written on a card. She paused. And then, he died. And I had to teach myself the second part. Nobody asked what the second part was. They didn't need to. There was a version of that second part in every person sitting around that fire, the part where you discover what you actually know when there's no one left to ask. The part where all the years of paying attention turn out to have been going somewhere after all. The part that comes after loss and is, in some ways that are hard to explain, entirely your own. Todd Greer had spent the morning doing exactly what Marin told him. Gathering snow for water, feeding the fire from the dry side of the pile, not touching anything on the skillet. He had not made a single joke. He had not offered any advice. He had not explained anything to anyone. At one point he looked up from the fire and said, quietly, to no particular person, "I didn't know she knew all this." Marin heard it. She didn't respond. She turned the second batch of cornbread in the skillet. She had more bacon drippings in the tin, had saved them precisely for this, because you save what matters. And the sound of the crust against the iron went through the cold air clean and sharp as a bell. The evacuation came at midday, a ranger's snowmobile, then 2 more, then a tracked vehicle for the gear. They loaded out in groups, everyone helping, the kind of cooperation that arrives naturally when the situation is larger than any one person's preferences. When they finished, Marin's fire was the last thing burning in the camp. She put it out herself, the proper way. Water, then dirt, then water again, checking the heat in the coals with the back of her hand held at a distance. Patient, even now, even leaving. She checked it twice. She always checked it twice. Then she tucked Dale's field notebook into her pack. She wrapped the handle of the skillet in the same strip of canvas she'd used for 30 years. She pulled on her pack and stood for a moment at the edge of the camp, looking back at the white silence where the fire had been. The dark circle of ground, the only bare earth visible in all that snow, still faintly warm. Then she walked out. Last, as she had arrived. They still talk about that trip, the people who were there. They talk about the morning of the storm, about the fire and the coffee and the cornbread, and what it felt like to be cold and then not cold, scared and then not scared, because someone who knew what she was doing was in charge of the one thing that mattered. They talk about how the fire didn't go out, how it just kept burning while everything around it was white and still and frozen. This steady, warm thing at the center of all that cold. They talk about Dale's notebook, about the page in the middle, the note about the Northwest Ridge and the marmots, and what to do when the pressure drops before October. About what it means that a man 30 years gone, writing in a water-stained notebook by headlamp on a night nobody else would remember, had left something that on a specific morning in October told 12 people exactly what they needed to know. Paul had photographed that page before he gave the notebook back. He carries the photo in his wallet. Marin heard all of this from Claire, who heard it from Janet. "They're all telling the story, Mom," Claire said. "You're the whole story. Your father's notebook is the story," said Marin. "And the skillet." "Mom, the skillet has been in the family for 60 years. I think it deserves some credit." Claire laughed, and that laugh, warm and easy and fully meant, sounded like nothing that had happened in the mountains on the first night. Marin was sitting on the porch when she took that call. The chair beside hers was empty, the way it was every evening now, and she had stopped pretending. She didn't notice. The mountains to the north were white, and the air had the iron smell of more snow coming, and she could read that smell now the way Dale had read it, with the same particular attention, and she held on to that. The fact that the things he'd put in her were still there and still working, outlasting him in ways she was still discovering. Sometimes the moments that humiliate you are carrying something you haven't opened yet. The skillet, the notebook, the 30 years of learning in the cold and the quiet and the early mornings, none of it had been visible to the people who laughed. That's the thing about what's built through years of quiet attention. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't perform. It just burns, steady and real, when everything else goes out. Has anyone ever underestimated you and lived to need you anyway? If this story meant something to you, leave us a comment below. Tell us about a time someone doubted what you knew. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss a story. And share this with someone who has been written off, looked past, or laughed at, and kept going anyway. Until next time. And they still talk about that fire in Elkhorn Basin. They say no one has built one like it since.